Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're tuning in from tonight, and welcome to another Redline live stream. This one effectively taking a look at why the regime in Syria collapsed so quickly and the tactics that brought down Assad in such a short period of time. It's a lot to cover here, so I'll crack straight into it. Obviously, as always, feel free to put your hand up if you have a question, and this will be recorded, so if you're a Patreon, you'll be able to listen to this afterwards, and I can also send you the presentation as well. As always, lots and lots of maps, so you'll have to forgive me because I'm going to be flicking between a million books throughout this. Okay, first up, I think the best place to start here is to kind of talk a little bit about Bashar and Jilani, so the two guys who are going to be kind of the main characters of our story here, and see how they fit in. Now, this is a story that I think a lot of the more general press, and I don't want to pick on AP here because I like AP for a lot of stuff, but there was this kind of talk about how all of this happened in 2 weeks, but this is probably not to be regarded as a 2-week campaign. This has been a pretty slow erosion for a long time and the straw that breaks the camel's back. So let's talk a bit about Bashar, I think, because it is two different Syrias we're looking at here. We've got the government-run Syria and we've got a rebel Syria. And I think looking at Jilani and Bashar gives you a really good idea on sort of the two contradicting sides here. Okay, so obviously Bashar has been president since 2000, so 24 years, born in 1965 in Damascus. He's the fourth of 6 children. And he's fairly quiet and soft-spoken. He graduated as a doctor of medicine from Damascus University in 1988 and moved to London to study ophthalmology. In all honesty, he's often regarded as the wrong brother. And this has always been the contradiction and problem in Syria policy circles, is his father had all these kids, 6 of them. Obviously, one of them dies very young, another one has problems. But Bassel, his older brother, was always being groomed to be the standard-bearer, the guy who is going to be take over from his father. He did his first degree in civil engineering. He's about 2 years older than Bashar. He's trained by the Soviet VDV, so the Soviet paratroopers, became a major and then the commander of a brigade in the Republican Guard, which is one of the key units in the Syrian army. He won equestrian medals. He's head of the Presidential Security Service. He is being groomed to be the leader of Syria. He then, unfortunately, in 1994, when his father's getting quite old, dies. He was driving his Mercedes around the Damascus airport way too fast and without a seatbelt on and effectively crashed the car. And at that point, everyone goes, oh, holy hell, we don't have a successor. We fall into a bit of a situation. We need to find someone. And it comes down to Bashar or his younger brother, Maher. Now, Maher is a bit of a, put it politely, a bit of a nutcase. He had shot the Deputy Minister of Defense at that point in the stomach over an argument. He used to beat his servants. He shoots his gun around all the time. He's got a short fuse. He's also the head of the 4th Armoured Division. We'll talk about it a bit later. So the family kind of puts Bashar in place and calls him back from England to become the leader of Syria. Recalled after the Bassel's death, he enters the military academy in 1994, propelled to the Republican Guard and wins the 2000 election. And win, I'm going to put in very big inverted quotes here. But you can see this kind of leader who was probably ready for this, and we'll go through what happens sort of from 2000 forward a bit later on. In contrast, we have Jilani, who again is a really interesting case, and I'm very sure he's read a copy of When Nations Fail, at least. He's the leader of effectively the Emir of HTS and the leader of Syria. He's born in Riyadh, and he's from a wealthy family from the Golan Heights, which if everyone isn't aware, is effectively a part of Syria that's currently occupied by the Israelis. Joined Al-Qaeda in 2003, fights with Al-Qaeda in Iraq from 2003 to 2006. He's jailed by the US. I've seen Camp Butcher. I've also seen Abu Ghraib is where he's held. It's a bit contradictory in where he is held. And he's held for 5 years. He then gets released and creates an al-Nusra Front, declared a global terrorist. In fact, the government, the US government has only just wiped away that $10 million reward very recently. He does a deal effectively merging ANF and AQ from HTS in 2016 and fights campaigns against ISIS. These are two very different stories, and yet we're going to see them clash and see what happens as we go on. So part 2, and I guess what I want to get across to everyone is that this is not a sudden event. And we talked about it a very long time ago. We did do an episode in Syria, but this has been a crumbling. And how I've been kind of talking about this with people is talking about the pillars. If in 2000, Syria's position is much more stable, and it has a lot of more powerful nations holding it up. So obviously we've got Lebanon here. It's probably not the Lebanese government we're talking about. It's more Hezbollah, making sure Hezbollah provides fighters, keeps everyone on the right track, helps fend off some of the Sunni problems they've got going on. Obviously, the Syrian state, Russia was one of the bigger partners during the Cold War. It kind of has a bit of a withdrawal during the kind of 90s, 2000s, when Russia, frankly, just has its own problems to deal with. The Americans in the 2000s are friendly. Again, Syria was a much more stable state back in the 2000s. In fact, at this point, it's one of the tourist hotspots of the region. And then obviously Iraq is Bashar and Saddam Hussein were quite close, mostly because they ran very similar style regimes of having a religious or ethnic minority in power, holding everyone else in check, and effectively running it in a dictatorship. Then we get into the 2000s. Now, Assad does survive the Damascus Spring. This is effectively one of the first uprisings against his rule. So, 2001, effectively, Bashar has all the incentives to make sure that religious extremists don't take over the country. Frankly, he's from a religious minority. He doesn't want to make that happen. So he actually is quite helpful and offers assistance and intelligence and works a bit with the US to combat Al-Qaeda in the region. He's never a full-throated partner. Like we'd look at probably the Saudis and the Israelis, but he's a friend. And then obviously the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And this scares the shit out of Bashar. Obviously, this is happening right next door and causes a massive disintegration and problems of the Iraqi state. Not only do you see Kurdish separatism, you see all sorts of fighters leaving Iraq, you see effectively, because of the Bush administration's policy of making sure that anyone who's a Ba'athist, so it effectively means anyone who had a job in government or knew how to use Microsoft Excel, could not be hired by the government or the new government, meaning that all these guys who were decent at running a state or mid-ranking generals, logistics units, those kind of guys all left and were looking for work. And they found work in extremist groups or fled into Syria. And this caused massive problems in the Syrian economy. So we kind of see the American pillar go, because obviously the Americans are more interventionist now in the Middle East, and Iraq is effectively out. The new regime is not going to be nearly as helpful or assistive to the Syrian state. And we can just see things are starting to, you're still stable, but not as much as you were. Again, this breakup of Iraq, not having Saddam effectively holding down every group, meant there was a lot more Kurdish and Sunni separatism, and obviously Kurdistan has a big chunk of Syria as well. Israel launches the Operation Out of the Box. This is to effectively try and get rid of what was supposed to be the nuclear weapons program that Syria was launching. So Israel is now intervening into Syria as well. And then there's the Syrian civil war and the Arab Spring, and that's the next big one that really starts to just break the country. And again, by this point, you can already see that the pressure's mounting. The economy's gone. We've seen all these guys flee into the area. We're starting to see more and more extremist groups. It's not only so the US starts to back certain anti-regime forces, and that obviously puts more pressure on Bashar and pushes him in a bit of a corner. And again, I'm not a Bashar apologist. I think it's just in context. And Sunni groups like ISIS begin to really crop up, and then we have the 2015 Russian invasion. 2015 is kind of when Russia is A, starting to want to counter the US. B, the US had lost a bit of its sheen, and the Russians are hoping to kind of capitalize on the, back in the Cold War, there used to be this dynamic of, well, I could go with the US or I could go with the Soviets, and one of the two. They want to kind of gain a bit of that back. And by operating outside of the former Soviet sphere, they were hoping to kind of show off a bit and do a bit more. And Syria was good because it was not too far from the Russian bloc. B, it was helping a government that was already friendly with the Russians. It provided them a port on the Mediterranean coast, and as well as it effectively combated groups like ISIS in the Middle East before they ended up bleeding into sort of Chechnya and the Caucasus as well. And that was where Russia would be more worried about fighting and intervening in that way. Effectively, Iran starts to become much more important. If you're looking at anti-ISIS operations, Iran, obviously being more Shia, was much more willing to fight, much more willing to help. And they became much closer with Iran than they were. And that will increase over time. We're also seeing the Syrian state is a shell of itself is very much weakened economically. Again, losing gas fields, losing oil fields, losing all this kind of stuff is going to have an effect on your economy. And obviously, Bashar's lovely face is in the way at the moment, but a lot of the more profitable gas fields are up here in the north. Much of that's now gone to the regime. 2015 comes along, Russia opens more bases and airfields around the country, increasing its presence. ISIS begins to recede. ISIS in the US starts to lose interest in supporting Syrian groups. War fatigue sets in. We start to see the US presence draw down. ISIS, this is coming out of the sort of the very end of the Obama administration. We obviously have in the middle here, the 2013 chemical warfare attacks. Obama set a red line, set a chemical warfare with cross. they did cross that line, then it became a bit of a quagmire the more they got involved. Again, there's lots of calls to get out of Iraq by this point. Now, obviously, at this point, there's a lot of domestic political pressure for the US to draw down their presence in the Middle East. Officially, the US have left Iraq, but obviously there's still a lot of PMCs there and some US operations that are still operating there. But there is a lot of more political emphasis to try and reduce presence in the Middle East. ISIS, and then March 30th, Nikki Haley says, our priority is no longer to sit there and focus on getting Assad out. Our priorities, which is almost signaling a big change in US policy in some circles. Our priorities, it was a bit of okay, we're starting to accept what's happening on the ground and we're willing to work with Assad. Our priorities, so we did start to think maybe the US comes back as a bit of a pillar here and uses Assad to kind of whack Iran or prevent Iran from being able to use Syria as freely and easily as they can. Then 4 days later, we saw another chemical warfare attack in Khan Shaykham. That was pretty unexpected. Again, this is much more controversial than the previous one, to put it mildly. Effectively, the UN's weapon team stated that it is not completely sure who launched it. It didn't really make sense for how it was done. Most of the intelligence provided by the Israelis. And on top of that, even Bellingcat came out and said that they have some doubts as to who launched this attack. This obviously then changed the narrative, and then the US launched a whole series of strikes afterwards and began the next ramp up in 2017 going forward. You start to see from 2017 going forward a lot more US and Israeli intervention. So US condemns, and at that point, Syria has very little choice but to throw all their eggs in with Russia. They start to recognize South Ossetia, they recognize Abkhazia, they start to back every Russian idea at the UN. We even saw them support the invasion of Ukraine, which is pretty big. And the US starts to have a bit of a dichotomy here where it's Russia backs Syria and Syria is firmly in the Russian camp. So by May, Assad has effectively completely thrown his weight in with Russia and Iran. And a lot of sanctions come down upon him, as well as the fact that a lot of the oil fields in the north of Syria are now allowed to operate, mostly operating under licenses from BP, Shell, and Suncor. Although Suncor would stop their operations fairly quickly. But the oil fields in the south would be pretty heavily sanctioned. And the only guys who were really running stuff out of there were Everopolis, mostly running with Russian assets. So we see the pillars. The Americans are gone. They have to double down on the Russians, and the Russians do increase their presence from here. But this is not a great balance to try and keep a regime afloat. So we come into 2017. Assad turns towards Russia, as we talked about. Trump withdraws from the JCPOA, which obviously then has this interesting effect in Iran. Effectively, for everyone who's not, hasn't listened to our full Iran piece, there's a dynamic you see in Iran where you have the conventional military, effectively the one that we think of as a military, the state itself. That is a military, and then you have guys like the IRGC and the Quds Force, who are paramilitary, more religiously aligned, more ideologically aligned. And unfortunately, whilst they both do get money from the state, the Quds Force and IRGC tend to get a lot more money from smuggling, kidnapping, selling drugs, weapons, you name it. And what that means is when you sanction a government, the sanctions disproportionately affect the state army than they do toward the paramilitary army. As the sanctions come down upon, the position of the IRGC becomes much stronger, and you see a much more hardline government or hardline military coming out of Iran. And that obviously is putting more pressure on Syria, because Iran uses Syria as kind of proxy between Iran, then the Shia parts of Iraq into Syria, and then onto Lebanon. Then Operation Spring Shield is launched by the Turks into the north of Syria. This effectively sets a very, very different power balance. Even as we go forward in the next few years, we start to see negotiations, even the ones that were happening quietly in places like Astana, where it's the Turks and the Russians talking about the future of Syria, with the Americans barely present, or the Americans not present in some of these talks. Turkey was really starting to become much more a power player in Syria for a whole bunch of reasons, whether it's to make sure that the Kurdish position doesn't become any stronger, whether it's to make sure they can contain the refugee crisis that's heading into the south of Turkey. Turkey really sort of announces its very strong presence in the country here with the port of Beirut explosion. Again, Lebanon's economy had been an absolute shambles for a very long time, but that was just a boot on the neck of the economy. And we now see that effectively there's massive actual problems in almost every direction that Syria looks. Effectively, we got very little support coming in from Iran. Iran's, after the JCPOA, has its economy effectively starts taking massive backpedals. Hezbollah and Lebanon have a much, much weaker position. But we've still got that Russian pin holding us up. And if anyone knows where this is about to go. Russia then invades Ukraine. And we now have effectively Russia having a much more resource intensive, much more problematic, much more difficult, much more important to the government in Moscow conflict to deal with. And it means that whilst there is support still for Syria and whilst they still do help them in a lot of battles, they're not really willing to put as much effort in. And a lot of the operations that are happening out of Syria are effectively diverted either towards Africa, where there's a lot more money to be made, or they're diverted back into Ukraine. The Syrian economy starts to go through massive inflation problems. And I'm looking at, this is a really fractious, poor country at this point. And then effectively go into 2023 and Israel starts launching lots of airstrikes across the country, attacking key members of the IRGC, anyone aligned with the Iranian army. The US goes through a series of airstrikes in March, October and November. And in 2023, you do see the opposition forces gaining momentum. Not too much. There's not, nearly the momentum we see coming in the last month, but we're starting to see more battles for places like Hama, and we're starting to see it becomes more difficult and more sort of strikes on camps or key infrastructure happening in other places, particularly in the north and east of the country. So you now have 4 pretty shaky pillars here holding the country up. And this is what I mean by these pillars. And then the October 7th attacks happen. Israel effectively goes much more aggressive across the region. Obviously, this conflict starts to draw in a lot of good fighters, the resources, the money, away from battlefields in Gaza and then after that, Lebanon. So a lot of your better fighters, a lot of your better smugglers, a lot of your reserve weaponry starts to be drained from Syria as the Israeli campaign against Gaza expands into fighting in the West Bank and then fighting in Lebanon and then obviously fighting in Syria later on. Which is why while prior to October 7th, you could usually expect 7,000 to 10,000 Hezbollah fighters in Syria at any point in time, often helping to defend the Assad government in the north of the country. By the time we end up in 2024, most of those fighters are dead or have been reassigned to defend southern Lebanon, which again just rots another one of these pillars that Assad was using to keep himself up. With this kind of rot also being induced by the Syrian state itself as well, particularly when it comes to corruption and over-reliance on crime and smuggling routes to try and keep the state afloat. After all, the economy right now is incredibly small, and the largest export in the country at this point in time is fruit and nuts and very basic stuff. So this is not a good time for the Syrian state. Corruption has been rotting the military for quite a long time now. That brother we talked about, the younger one, he is in charge of the 4th. And because there is such a problem with corruption, and a lot of these guys are relying on the sale of what's called Pentagon, which is a drug, to fund a lot of their stuff, you end up having most of the military now having a sort of officer corps that's made up of guys from the loyal 4th, and then a bunch of fairly badly paid soldiers that take orders from the leadership of the 4th. So defections are probably going to be pretty high when they happen. They do fight a few battles themselves, and they do somewhat well, but this is a military that is pretty rotten at this point. They have lots and lots of equipment and lots of bullets lying around, but they also have very little way to ramp up the amount of bullets they have. Again, they're relying on Russia, and at this point, Russia still have other demands all over the place, and pay is just not getting to where it needs to go. You're also seeing a trend over this next sort of, let's call it 2019 forward, where power, water, electricity, governance is improving in the SDF and HTS and all these kind of areas, and it's going way down in the Syrian areas because they're under sanctions, then lack of support's coming in, and it's just getting harder to do. Turkey's also throwing a lot of money in here. So effectively, wages are growing in the SDF and the FSA areas while falling in the Syrian armed forces areas. And support will continue to be diverted away from all their allies. Iran, obviously with October 7th, it's dealing with problems in Lebanon, is trying to give some support to the Houthis in the Red Sea, or fighting battles or trying to give support to Gaza as well. And that just leaves less money on the table to help with the Syrians. So effectively, they're watching everyone just take less and less interest. We can now see how these pillars really start to disappear, and you have a pretty wobbly foundation for the Syrian state. This is what I mean by it's not a 2-week problem. It's been growing for a while. So this is effectively what the country looked like on day 0. So we'll call day 0 effectively November 26th. So we'll start with red because it's the biggest country. This is effectively the Syrian armed forces. That is the government. That is Bashar al-Assad's area. Again, you got to realize that as much as this is a huge area, there's no one who lives out here. All your major population centers are kind of Dara, Damascus, Homs, Hama, Aleppo, Idlib, Afrin. Manbij is kind of big, but Raqqa is bigger. But you can see here that effectively, yes, the Syrian army is in charge of the majority of the country. This is Israeli occupied territory. This is effectively the SNA, who are backed by Turkey. And then obviously you've got the HTS, who is also backed by Turkey. I know I see a lot of people, and Wikipedia for some reason says that they're supported by Ukraine and Qatar. Qatar gave them some money, and Qatar tends to do some backing in this area. But Ukraine, apart from the sort of assistance in training of drones, it's not a contribution to this one. So if we look at who's backing the red guys, so your Syrian armed forces, we talked about Hezbollah, Iran, Russia. They do some work with China. It's not massive, but China is effectively just trying to help with everyone. If we look at, let's say, the HTS, so the green guys, Turkey is your main contributor, but again, they have got some old US weapons from the US with supporting guys up here. Then they have the SDF, obviously the big yellow area. This will have a whole bunch of different names depending on how you divide it, but we're just going to go SDF to be really generic and keep it as simple as we possibly can. And I've got a bit of a Kurdish flag here because they often are categorized as a Kurdish group, but they're not even majority Kurdish anymore. They are a ragtag bunch of different factions, rebel groups, fighters. It is just an absolute basket of which we'll talk about it being problematic a bit later on. They do have some backing from the US and UK. They had a little bit there where effectively the UAE and the Saudis are backing them for a bit, but they pulled out. Iraq will absolutely hate them at times and then support them at other times. Russia has given them money in the past, mostly when they're fighting against the Turks, and they pulled that money back. But these guys would like to see a free Kurdish state. I have often beefed with the government in Baghdad as well. But yeah, this is a lot of open areas. There's not a huge population up here compared to some of these cities. But it's getting much more complicated. These guys have probably been on a bit of a, not downslide, but not nearly as strong as they probably were at one point. But yeah, if you see anyone saying they are a Kurdish group, yeah, you can kind of say that, but I probably wouldn't, not anymore. They are a majority Syrian Arab group. Let's take a look at some air bases. You can see here how the population density just on air bases here as well. That your major air bases are down here in Damascus, or right down the south, along the coast. And then obviously Khomeini, which is the big one. That's the big Russian one. And then we've got a few air bases up here because this is where the majority of the fighting's been. I mean, if you look at the kind of previous battles that have been going on, there have been so many pushes by ghillie groups up here down towards Hama and Aleppo. So it's not surprising that there's a lot of force up here. But out here, there's almost nothing. The black circles are, for lack of a better word, ISIS, but they kind of just strike out from here. They don't really hold territory. It's just kind of these groups are around this area. It's kind of just something to keep in the back of your mind. If we look at ground forces as well, and again, this is oversimplified a bit, and we're talking about mostly division or brigade level stuff here. But you can even see the huge concentration of good forces. So the headquarters of the 4th are in Damascus, even though they're kind of mostly carved up and put around everywhere else. But most of your stuff is concentrated around here in the south, keeping the regime safe, common. The US have about, depending if you want to go official sources, say 900. I can tell you it's probably closer to 1,000 soldiers in here. And they're also supporting the Revolutionary Commando Army. Effectively, this is mostly just to make sure that they can control roads, monitor stuff, and launch. There's not a huge population out here. But yes, the US tend to run out of Al-Tanf, which is about here. Obviously, Homs has got a whole division sitting in it. The 8th has got a whole division sitting in Hama. There's quite a lot of forces sitting in Aleppo, and this is one of the things that kind of caught a lot of people off guard, that there was so much on-paper force sitting in Aleppo. The Russians have some anti-air regiments and battalions up here, get some coastal missile battalions as well. And on top of that, they've also got Tartus, and we'll talk a bit more about Tartus later on. The SDF are mostly concentrated around Raqqa, Manbij, and just here. I remember this is the Euphrates River, so effectively this has been the dividing line for most of it. So this is effectively where we are on the 26th of December. Well, 26th of November, sorry. Okay, So for now, I'm going to merge to make it nice and easy and not as confusing for everyone. I'm going to merge the HTS and the SNA together. I know that's absolute sacrilege to most Syria analysts, but they are both backed by Turkey. They're both roughly, it gets really squiffy in the first few days, particularly who take which city, because they are kind of working together at this point. They have very similar goals, and their overall goals of seeing the regime collapse are fairly similar, but they'll diverge later on. So I'm going to be sacrilegious and I'm going to put these two together, but they are roughly, if you were going to merge two of them, that would probably be the ones you'd merge. So this is day one of the offensive, and again, was not big news at the time. 27th of November, day one. So we start this assault by effectively watching HTS forces and even some of the SDF forces, who again, it's hard to know if they were coordinating with them. Maybe they probably were, but they might have just seen that, hey, there's pressure on Aleppo from the west, let's make a push now. But that would make sense as well. So either one, it really depends. But the Military Operations Command, which is effectively the HTS and what becomes the SNA, the Syrian National Army, again, the Syrian Democratic Force, it's a very complicated situation. So for now, they start pushing towards places like Aleppo and start pushing into the Hama government or governorate. But this is not a huge push. Again, they've seen pushes around this area before. They've seen people push for it. You know, this is not that unusual, and they start making some gains. It's a not unexpected assault, and the Syrian forces somewhat respond. Effectively, from what I read here, they start launching airstrikes. The Russians haven't helped too much. Again, the Russians are much more hesitant to use their air assets when they don't need to. Again, you got to remember right now, for every, let's say, hour of airtime you have with a MiG-29, you're probably going to have 10 hours of maintenance out of it. So if Russia doesn't have to use its air force, it's probably not going to want to. As well as the fact that it's much harder to now supply the bases in Tartus. You know, back in the day, they could effectively either come through the Bosphorus and sail stuff in, which is obviously the cheapest way. But now they've either got to go back up to Petersburg and around through the English Channel, around Spain, and then all the way to Tartus, or fly things in on IL-76s, which again, if you're putting anything heavy into the area, is an expensive operation. And I don't know if you guys know this, but Russia's kind of got other priorities at the moment, to put it mildly. So what was surprising about this is the first time the opposition launched a really big assault or something of this size since about 2020, when there was a ceasefire around Idlib. So some of my kind of guys who watch Syria, or I follow, were saying, hey, this is a big thing. But no one was really suggesting it was going to be anything more than maybe they get a city or two. But in the first day, they actually also caught one of the Russian special forces training operations off guard. It was just happened to be in the area doing some work, and ambushed them and killed a good chunk of them. So again, this was a pretty shocking assault, but not crazy out of the way. So let's go to day two. Okay, you can see here that effectively, we're not actually, not do day one, day two comparisons. So day one, and lay them over. This is why I did this. Day two. So we actually don't gain a huge amount. We're gaining a little bit in the sort of the outer suburbs of Aleppo. So not a huge get. Oh, and some stuff down here towards Newman. So there was a build up. It's not unexpected this time of year. What was unexpected is what we start to see on November the 28th, which is effectively that we start seeing Syrian forces laying down weapons. Not hugely, but there is a problem, and we'll go through it a bit later on. Actually, we talked a little bit about it in the coup video as well, but there's going to be a bit of a momentum that will start to shift. HTS, so the green guys, start to capture 20 towns. Again, most of these are really tiny towns, but they're starting to see the first instances of, let's say, very, very poor weapons. So technicals, just like Toyota Hiluxes strapped with machine guns, are effectively coming up against T-64s, and the tanks are surrendering. And it's just because these guys are not paid, they're hungry, they're over it, and they don't want to be caught by this. If they think the momentum's changing, then some of them will surrender. There's attacks on the airport, which is just in the sort of the southeast here in Aleppo, and we start to see Iranian proxies surge into the area. Not a huge amount. Again, Iran's kind of busy at the moment. But by the end of the day, we see about 40 villages have been captured. Not a huge amount. Russia starts carrying out some more airstrikes, but they're still fairly limited, and they're mostly on sort of areas that the HTS has recently taken, rather than sort of striking at key points within these command structures. And again, that will be for one, It's Russia's intelligence on where the key leaders and whatnot are probably not great. I've heard that from guys inside the loop that Russia doesn't have the best intelligence on what's going on in some of these areas. And two, there is also a risk that if you go, let's say, strike one of these headquarters buildings, you'll accidentally kill some Turkish officers. And I think Russia really doesn't want to start that problem with them. You can avoid it. Right now, the Russians are very reliant on the Turks to get some stuff out to market. So we also start to see, this is the first day we start to see a senior official from the other side die, where one of the senior generals from the IRGC is killed just outside Aleppo. Turkey also supplied a lot of drone support in this one. So effectively offered them some small drones, some drone intelligence, and offered recon for a lot of this as well. Again, the green guys are backed by Turkey. So this is day 2. And again, not a huge gain yet. So let's look day 3. So I'll put both on, I'll layer them on top of each other so you can see. And we just see there's a bit of gains, toward the edge of Aleppo, but we still haven't even taken Aleppo. And again, we're day 3 of this conflict and not much has changed. Wider battlefield. Here we go, day 3. In fact, let me turn off some layers so we can have a better look. Yeah, now we can see here that effectively we're now seeing the SDF forces who are now sort of getting to the industrial areas in the northeast of Aleppo, whilst real pressure is being applied onto the south and west. HTS, quite a lot on this day, start taking a bit of prisoners. They're moving into the neighborhoods of Aleppo. This is when the Western press really starts to pick it up. The Russians start to launch airstrikes on infrastructure inside SNA territory. Again, that's a change from the last couple of days. And you're finding that Aleppo really can't organize defense. The Syrians have taken orders and surged men in here, but they're just not setting up good defenses. What should have been done days ago is probably just getting underway now. And it shows. Particularly, I think they were relying on which is a special forces group, to effectively hold everything. And they haven't got a lot of the supplies they need. They're not well moraled. Their pay is pretty awful. And they're not holding as well as they were. And this is the problem with, and you'll see this with a lot of countries, is you really shouldn't look at a country like Syria in the same way you look at something like Ukraine. In Ukraine, let's say you have one village and you can fall back to the next village. And it's pretty easy, it's fairly easy to fall back to the next village. 20 minutes drive. It's really not a long journey. And there's also like 4 or 5 different roads you can to that village. Because everything in Syria is just blistering desert, everyone can see you from a million miles away and target you. These long roads are fairly dangerous to be convoying down if your enemy particularly has access to aerial weaponry. And this you really kind of think about if you're looking at logistics on these kind of areas as an archipelago, that it's jumping between towns is going to be your danger point. So if you are, let's say, losing Aleppo, you're not going to go and fight here, or here or here. You are going to be probably thinking, shit, the next place to fight will be down here in Hama. It is why you lose Aleppo, then effectively there'll be almost no fighting all the way back down to Hama. And then once you lose Hama, there's no fighting all the way back down to Homs. So with Aleppo starting to collapse, it's now the guys here are panicking and going, okay, well, I got to pull out. They're worried that particularly now there's pressure being this highway's closed and they don't know how much the SDF might push in. Well, it's probably worth pulling all the way back to Hama. And we're going to start to see that happening in the next day or so. So 29th, the 25th reinforced and they pull back to the citadel. A lot of their guys who are defending the flanks are getting the hell out of Dodge. And you're also finding problems that because I've had that idea, so has every civilian in the area. They've had that idea as well. So all the roads that were coming up from Hama toward this area are now clogged with civilians trying to go south. Again, that's a problem we have when you only have a single road or highway going down, because now a single civilian truck breaks down or someone's got livestock on the road and congrats, you've now held up an entire convoy. Again, nothing seems like it's the end of the world for the regime, but if losing Aleppo would be a big morale blow and weaken what is already seen as a pretty weak government. So let's go into November 30th, the end of November. I'll put the 2 on each other so we can have a better look in. This is where we start to see first big gains. Again, in the early hours of the 30th, Aleppo will fall. And this is where the news really starts to pick up and go, whoa, something's happening in Syria. And this starts to spread through Syria as well. And news and opinion, where people feel the tide is going, is a very important thing. We talked about this a bit in our coup presentation we did a little while ago. But if you have, let's say, in any coup, let's say 20% of people are really loyal to the government, will die hard, end of the world, willing to ride or die. And there's 20% on the other side of people who are really into this coup and really want to oversee it. That's 60% of people in the middle. They are guys who will, much like when Wagner is driving down the highway, will kind of just step out the way and see what happens. They don't want to be caught picking the wrong side because you end up dead afterwards. So let's kind of see what's going on. You're going to start to see a lot of that happening where they go, maybe this regime isn't as stable as it once was. And that does become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy at times. But you are going to see a lot of these civilian towns who are not really willing to fight, maybe willing to back off. So obviously in the early hours in the morning, the citadel falls and Aleppo falls. Again, not huge casualties, but a lot of guys laid down their arms, probably having seen the fact that the areas to the north of them had been better fed, better supply, better job prospects for a little while. And that obviously that does help the situation if you're trying to take over. HTS had obviously read some books or taken some advice and goes in being somewhat gentler on the civilians than previous groups had been. And this was a problem that particularly some of your Al-Qaeda, some of your ISIS groups who'd been into some of these cities had been much more aggressive when they came in. And that does breed resentment. Obviously, longer term, you do find that people will accept a lot of changes in what's happening on the ground if they get power, water, and everything else. But they did slightly behave themselves a little bit more as they came in. Anyway, so we're coming into the 30th. And Aleppo has fallen. But Aleppo, we'll turn off some layers again so we can get a better look at it. And you can see here that effectively Aleppo right now is divided between the SDF, which again, they're not Kurdish, but just to make it easy in the back of your mind, and HTS. And anyone who effectively could get out of the city has got out of the city knowing that, hey, now that we've seen this push down from the north, down from Idlib down, again, they're not facing massive resistance, but we still haven't come across any of the really big cities like Hama. Was there fighting between HTS and SDF? Not yet. There will be, I think, tomorrow. Again, at this point, and you find this with a lot of civil wars, is that you have, at the very start, everyone gets along. Everyone's got a unified goal. They've all got something to hate together. It's only when you start to see, okay, now we need to start halving up the board, that these guys start to really turn on one another. So at this point, Russia has started to actually step up its airstrike. I think Russia can see that this is a problem, mostly striking at columns coming down here. It's worried that if Hama falls too quickly, that might start a chain reaction. The power stations are starting to be captured as well. That's not a good sign. SDF does take some of the more industrial areas of the city, but they are not as well armed. So for instance, you'll find the SDF guys are usually just holding a backpack and a rifle, whereas you find the HTS guys have got a bit more gear with them, which makes it pretty hard for the SDF to hold their positions when they get pressure applied to them. Again, this is where Turkey has been in the area for a while, has been supplying these guys, has been training them a bit better, and that'll start to really pay off. Pro-government forces behind. So we're starting to also see pro-government forces abandon things that are valuable, or start to strip what they can out of it. And this is a problem that you have, a value for stripping. So take a T-72 or take a tank, for instance. When you strip out, let's say, some of the wiring out of that tank, or you strip out the guidance system, or you strip out just some of the computers out of it, you might be able to sell them on a black market for, I don't know, $100, $200, whatever you need. It's not a huge amount, but you've now just commissioned an entire tank. And that's a problem. Draining it of the fuel to fill up with a couple of vans so you can get out of there is pretty understandable if you're in this position. But now you've just made an entire tank inoperable, and then you're going to start to see that pile up as well. Okay, so here we also see the first of the kind of the bigger air bases fall, and this is the day that Russia carries out its pretty infamous strikes on the Idlib hospital. Why they would do that, I have no idea. They claim there was operatives inside. I think it's possible, but it was a pretty bad PR move regardless. This is where we are, coming into December 1st. Okay, so December 1st is where you start to see the SNA and the SDF start to turn on each other. Again, they all feel that now, however the board is set now, is how things are going to lie. So they start to turn on each other. And I think let's make, again, and we'll turn off flags so we can get a better idea on what we're shooting at. Okay, so you can see here that effectively, not only are they starting to lose towns up here, this one was previously owned by the SDF, but they're also now surrounded in Aleppo. They're isolated to just some of the industrial areas in the north of the city. It's not particularly bloody, but again, it's one of those, when you're holding a, frankly, Cold War era rifle, and your opponent has technicals and very basic body armor, I can understand the imperative to think maybe I should just pull back to a stronger position or regroup with the rest of my forces. You also start to see the SDF making some gains up here. Mostly, again, taking advantage of the situation because there is almost no population out here and the government is starting to really, why would the government hold a position here when all the retreating roads are starting to dissolve behind you? If you're a soldier who's not a high morale soldier, you're going to be a bit more hesitant to get to the last bullet. You're going to want to either regroup somewhere where you think you can be resupplied and push back out from. And again, that has been a strategy that has been successful for these guys. Holding Hummer and then using Hummer to kind of push these groups back has worked for them in the past. So it's not completely surprising. Now let's turn these all back on again. Okay, we're starting to see fighting between these guys, whilst HTS is more focused on starting to push toward the sort of the northwest and northeast of Hummer. And again, there is also a problem here that there isn't that many good roads heading this way. If you lose this highway point here, you are going to find it much harder to get out to the coast. So that's the horrifying point. If they lose Homs, you'll end up losing a lot of access to your guys here on the coast. Anyway, not important for now, but I'm sure it's going to play in later. Yeah, we're also starting to see a lot of the telecommunications start to get cut off. So we're starting to see some pretty nifty targeting of phone towers, telecommunication sites, just making it much harder. Again, a lot of these Syrian soldiers are pretty underfunded and they are relying on things like basic phone towers to do communication at times, and that makes it much more difficult to coordinate and it starts panic. Again, these guys are thinking that they may be the last ones there. They really don't want to be caught to be the last one in the uniform, and they may consider, okay, well, let's just get out of here quickly because I don't want to be, by what is probably assumed pretty radical forces coming for them. A lot of these guys would have fought with guys from the al-Nusra front, or they would have fought against ISIS and really don't want to be captured by that. We'll also see the Syrian chair of the armed forces, Abdul Karim Mahmoud Ibrahim, will arrive in Hama, which again was supposed to be a show by the regime that we are prepared to hold the line in Hama. And again, this is where most Syria analysts, apart from a few, really thought we were going to go with this. Losing Aleppo was a big chapter in this, but they'd probably hold in Hama and logistics would probably not get them that much further. And, that would be where we call it. I think even at this point, the ISW guys who do sort of daily reporting on this kind of conflict, I don't think they're even doing reports on this December first day they start actually talking about the war, because of the fact that people don't see this as that unusual. We also start to see the SDF realize their position is untenable against the SNA and they started to pull back towards Manbij, which is in here. And it's going to be what they view as the stronghold on the west bank of the Euphrates River. But yes, this is where the press starts to realize that Syria might be a bigger story than it is. And you have this weird, December 2nd, I actually did an interview where I got asked about this on just a random interview about different. Even I was kind of like, I think it's, a big story, but it's not, I think it's too early to suggest that it's going to collapse. It's a long way to go before they reach Damascus. But, here we are. So December 2nd, actually we'll put the first one again so we can see territorial changes. We start to gain some ground here. And again, this is where desert countries become really deceptive because it looks like between the first and the second, we gain all this ground when we probably gained, probably took over control of, let's call it 80, 300 civilians. There's pretty much no one living out here, but it does look impressive on a map, which is probably why most of the press started into it. Anyway, so we are starting to cut off more of the roads heading back from Aleppo back down here. The HTS guys are effectively starting to enclose in. The 25th makes a bit of a counter-offensive. We do see HTS get a bit blunted today. They are struggling to enter into the north of Hama, which again has happened a whole bunch of times. We are seeing a bit more success as they push out toward the western roads, trying to cut some of these crossroads here, but they are stopped in their tracks. Again, this is not a huge amount of forces, and we're having this kind of thing where in some places they're pushing against an open door, and in other places they are coming across resistance. We start to see lots more drone strikes on logistical units and areas in Hama, and that starts to really worry some of the guys in the city. We're also seeing lots more pressure on the SDF guys. This is the time we're starting to really see the SDF and the SNA start to fight each other, and that'll set some tone up for later on. Let's get back down. Assad also starts to meet and talk to other foreign ministers and effectively beg for help. We're just saying, hey, look, maybe this is a bit bigger than we used to. some help here would be lovely. The Iraqi PMF also begins to move some assets out of North Syria. So effectively, even the Iraqis are starting to see the tea leaves on the ground and go, this is not nearly as good as what usually happens. And this is probably due to the fact that Aleppo fell so quickly, and there's been a lot of abandonment of vehicles to the north of Hama. Again, I think I should stress that from an on-paper perspective, or unless you're aware at just how high the rate of infections or just how poorly some of these units have been fighting, none of this seems too far from what's happened in the past. On multiple occasions, we've seen groups like HTS push south from their strongholds in places like Idlib down towards Hama, and whilst they can take some of the smaller villages along the highway toward the area, they can never really break into Hama, and they can never really get the logistics together to make it a really decent assault. So it wouldn't be that unusual for a Syrian general kind of just glancing at paperwork to go, oh, this is just another assault on Hama. Nothing to cancel my holiday plans about quite yet. Other governments are starting to see that this might not be business as usual. Some of the Iraqis and the Iranians, particularly after seeing how quickly Aleppo fell, are having doubts toward the regime and its ability to defend the area. But if I were a betting man, I assume that there probably would be a few politicians around now thinking that the rebels may Aleppo and the areas north of Hama, but that might be as far as they get. Most of the time they make it to Hama, they get kicked and they head back up and they kind of regroup back around here. So again, this probably feels like deja vu to the Assad government at this point. The Iraqi PMF, also begins to move some assets out of North Syria. Okay, December 3rd. So the government will collapse on the 8th. So we are 5 days from collapse, and we have not advanced that far into the country. And again, it doesn't look like we're 5 days from collapse. So between the 2nd and the 3rd, almost no territorial difference. There's a bit more progress as the HTS forces begin to sort of further out and start moving to the west and east of Hama. And that's, again, two reasons. One, it gives them better positions. Attacking from the north is where what defenses there are made by the 8th are put in place. It also just starts to form a panic. And again, whether it be Afghanistan, whether it be this, if troops feel like they're going to be cut off, and again, unlike Ukraine where you could probably scoot out the forest, there is only one road out, you can create a panic and start to push people to get out faster than they should. So the opposition takes about 10 more towns. There's more strikes by the Russians, but they are starting to slow down the tempo. And Russia now begins to move some of its assets out to sea. They claim it's part of a pre-booked exercise. It's possible. I think they probably just knew it was probably cheaper to get them out of there and figure out what's going on, just in case things do start to fall apart. Drones start targeting, SAA air bases. So we're starting to see sort of Syrian Air Force assets get destroyed on the ground. Pro-regime forces also start falling back to Homs. So not only are civilians kind of starting to stream down here, starting to see a lot of regime guys go, I don't like the fact we're being almost surrounded. Let's pull back to Homs, and that way I can either scoot out and head to the coast or head back down toward Damascus if things really start to fall apart. And this is where two big things start to happen as well. The SDF take advantage of the situation. They've just lost a bunch of territory in the north. Effectively, all that's left of their possessions around Aleppo is this tiny little pocket in the industrial area. But they actually started launching their own offensives here along the Euphrates, taking some of the towns that are either parts where the regime has a bridgehead on the other side, or whether just pushing across the bridgehead and taking some of these little towns. Some of them are a bit larger, but they're generally quite small. The SDF, even though if they were ready or they weren't, are starting to take advantage of the situation. So if the SDF managed to cut off these roads, it makes it much more difficult to supply along these main roads, particularly through Tadmor as well. You also see Iranian militias start to fire upon US positions here, and the US will retaliate with some force, start targeting ISIS forces and Iranian militias that usually transit through these routes, usually down through here along the western bank of the Euphrates and out toward here. Yeah, we're also starting to see the incompetence of the Syrian military. So at Al-Rastam, effectively they try and pull across the bridge, and not only do some of the guys forget to blow the bridge, but they try to blow it up with aircraft, which is obviously way more difficult. And they fail to do so. And when they do so, they accidentally hit some of their own guys. It's a bit of a debacle. And again, it just feeds that panic that's starting to set in between some of these northern commanders, because all those kind of things are going to make much more impact on social media than a lot of other stuff will. So panic is starting to set in. So Let's go to December 4 or 8. Continue our countdown, like the worst advent calendar of all time. I'll put the two together. You can see here, we've gained effectively some territory around here. Some of these areas have fallen. But again, there's very little population. What this does, though, is it cuts the road between Raqqa and these central areas and Homs. So now any of the government forces who are sort of stationed along this bank of the river are now panicking because they only have the one road back toward Damascus, which is this one through Tadmor. So you're going to start to see more panic around these guys going, okay, well, I don't want to be caught, out here. Because again, unlike video games where your character kind of, if you're moving little men around the board or whatever, who have infinite bullets, these guys don't have that much supply left on them, particularly if they're out here in the middle of nowhere. And if they, let's say, find themselves under a firefight, whether it's with ISIS or the SDF, because again, ISIS is really starting to pick up steam at this point as well, just going, whoa, okay, everything's falling apart, let's try and grab whatever we can. If you shoot through your, couple of hours worth of bullets and there's no road connecting you back to Damascus, you're probably screwed. You do not want to be caught with no bullets. So again, just helps the panic kind of set in. So the fourth, HTS bypasses some of the government strong points, and we start to see them move here. We're starting to just surround the city, causing panic, not fighting too much head on. This is also the first point you start to see Russian air assets, particularly the more expensive ones. The S-300s, S-400s, those kind of guys are going to start to get shoved back to Baim or back to Tartus, to be either shipped out of the country or just packaged up, ready to go. Again, it's a lot easier to move them out and have them ready to be shipped out than to put them in position and try and shift them out in more of a hurry. And again, we're not fighting a military that's got a lot of missile assets or a lot of aircraft, so they're not probably the most needed thing here anyway. So HTS starts bypassing strong points, starting to surround the city from the east and southwest through. They take some of the hills overlooking. We're also starting to see government forces pull back, so everyone's trying to get out now. And Jelani now arrives effectively at the gates of Hama, which again is a big sign that the general's there. He's anticipating that he will be ready to walk in and have that press photo of him entering the city, which again is always a big thing for foreign press to see, because even if they only control, let's call it 30% of the town, they have the leader walking in and kind of walking past a very noticeable part of the city that people could Google, it'll make it seem much more control of the town, and that might convince people already fighting in the town to pull back and move away. And again, it does work. A lot of guys are starting to panic. We're starting to see more US forces are starting to do a lot of bombing of the Syrian positions along the western bank of the river and on ISIS positions as well, which is just causing more panic by the 17th reserve guys out here. Again, these aren't particularly well supplied either. So again, 3 days to collapse, and we haven't even got Hama yet, but we do. We get it today. So today is the 5th of December, and Hama is effectively surrounded. They push into the city, and most of the people have left. By the way, that chief of the armed forces for Syria has been killed, military strike. But yes, effectively means that anyone who is, left on this side of the mountains is having to either take some pretty awful mountain roads back towards the coast or is starting to try and run south. And again, there's not great highways through this area here. It's quite deserty. But we're also starting to see this is one of the first civilian uprisings up near Rastam, where people are in anticipation of Jelani's forces coming through are going, well, we're probably going to get treated better if we overthrow or we toss the government off, and big name of it. And it's why, and if they're not fighting back, why would you waste your ammo shooting at civilians when you're going to give up the town? But it does, again, help that narrative. Civilians are rising up against you. Okay, now this may be something more serious. And this is where I think every Syria analyst is now cancelling holidays. But again, Homs is still a fairly strong city. Maybe they can hold at Homs. That's the idea. But a lot of the armor that was sitting in Hama is now lost or captured, and there's really starting to panic setting in Damascus. So let's go through the 6. Assad is now under real pressure. They're starting to talk of a coup in Damascus. People are starting to put pressure on him to step down or leave, and he starts to have his phone calls reportedly, and again, we don't know, we can't confirm, but a lot of the other governments stop taking his phone calls, all expecting that he will fall fairly soon. Iran sends some drones and some advisors, but doesn't send much more. And that's a big sign, because Iran is a massive, massive reliance on Syria staying the way it was. So if Iran is not sending that much, it means that Iran either doesn't have the capacity to do so, which is quite probable as well, but it also means that Iran it's going to lose Syria. And now people are starting to hedge bets going, how much do I want to back Assad if Assad is going to be falling in a little while anyway? I want to probably keep my hands somewhat clean with the incoming administration, or what they think could be the incoming administration. But it's, again, not certain. Homs is still to fall. So the Iranian, Iraqi, and Syrian foreign ministers have a fly to Baghdad for a meeting, and they start talking about what they can do to solve the situation. Again, the fact that the Syrian foreign minister is out of the country gives you an indication that they still think this is salvageable for now. And also Assad is starting to talk to Russia more often at this point. They're at the outskirts of Homs, again, because there's not much between Hama and Homs. It's only about 45 or an hour drive. Rastan's fall, Talbiseh has fallen as well. And now we're starting to see SDF captured some key cities on the western bank of the river, probably thanks in part to the US strikes on Syrian positions at this point. We're now also starting to see locals in the south, so the Southern Operations Council, starting to actually get ready to make their own uprising. Losing stuff in the north here, the guys in Damascus can still feel a little bit comfortable. They're still a bit far away. No one's family's coming for them yet. But when these guys in the south start popping off, that's when everyone starts going, okay, last man out, turn off the lights. Anyway, so down here in the south is actually quite a lot of really good units. And again, it shows you kind of the Syrian defense priorities. Again, I talk about this all the time, saying, look at where deployments are, and it gives you a good idea on where their foreign policy is and what the deployment structure is, what their list of, major threats are. And again, these guys view Israel as a really major. So you have a lot of the better units in the country actually down here in the south guarding cities out here who are not particularly friendly with the government here either. A lot of your religious minorities, whether they be Druze, whether they be all sorts of different ones, are going to effectively lose support for the regime pretty quickly. We're going to start to see the Southern Operations Room, because they have got backing from Israel. They've also got some backing from Jordan. They've got some backing from other players as well, but they are probably, if anything, most closely tied with Israel, are going to start to sort of positions. Okay. So
December 6th or day 11 of the campaign.
You can start to see that the Southern Operations Room to effectively gain small positions here in the south. This is obviously a big airfield here, which falls pretty quickly. And that will put massive pressure on Damascus, because they know that this is only going to gain momentum, and that's not a long drive. And if these guys got nowhere to run, now they've really got to start thinking, particularly as now you've got pressure on Homs. And again, they haven't taken them into the city yet. They're just sitting in the north of the city. But the roads here, there's only a few. And if you are sitting in Damascus right now, you know that effectively, you can't go out through Lebanon very easily. That's obviously a risky route at the moment. But getting out right across the country into the desert is becoming increasingly harder, with the SDF capturing more and more of these cities on the river. This road is going to close any moment now. And obviously going out through the south, Jordan is going to be one of the most hostile to you as you come over. And obviously Israel is very much hostile to you. And again, it's that if they had lots of time to get out, if it was hey, look, we got heaps of places to retreat to, if it's like Ukraine where, the whole front behind you, you go 20 miles back from the front and you go back to pretty friendly territory, different story. But these guys know that, hey, if I don't leave right now, if I don't get in my car and go, there's a chance I might never get that opportunity. And that's where you start to see the panic of now's the time to throw off and let's go for it. So, and the big problem we have here is the 52nd Brigade, which is here, just surrenders as well. And that obviously sets a massive, massive problem and alarm bells off in Damascus going, okay, shit, one of our bigger, better units is now surrendered. And that was supposed to hold effectively this highway here. And if now we've got effectively not very much guarding this highway up, what about the other highways? Things are really starting to get a bit problematic. The Russian ships in town at this point was a Kilo-class sub, Gorshkov-class frigates, Gorgoevich-class frigates, some oilers. They now return back to Tartus. Part of that will be a bit of a show of support. Others will probably more likely be just to actually start gathering up equipment and getting non-essential personnel out of there. They're starting to think that this may be going problematic as well. Well, Putin is reportedly, if you want to believe the press, very annoyed at how quickly Syria is collapsing, and is really annoyed that they're going to have to start scrambling these S-300s and S-400s out of the Syrians' hands, because they really don't want those falling into the wrong hands. Here's where we are. We are December 6th, so we are probably 2 days off the surrender or the collapse of the government. And you can see here, if I were just looking at a map and I knew nothing about war or geopolitics or the country, things don't look that bad considering let's go day 0. Yeah, we've only gained like, a handful of towns. You can just see pure area doesn't necessarily make all the difference. December 7th, I'll put it 6 here so we can compare. So obviously this is a big gain. They make some gains up here and some gains down here. But December 7th, what we see is the Revolutionary Commando Army. The guys down here with the US. It's not the US forces that do it, but it's their aligned forces. Capture the roads here and here, effectively just to make sure that it becomes much harder and puts much more pressure on the Syrian government to panic and go, okay, well, now our roads heading out towards Iraq, we now have no option to get into, or very little option to Iraq without either helicopters or bribing our way through or heading on some pretty tiny little dirt roads, in which case you are now looking at not sending convoys out, but this is individual kind of vans, trucks, Mashrukas, whatever you can get out of there. And you can just see that now the walls are closing in. The southern guys, largely led by the Druze, taking ground is probably not the right word to say. They're rising up, and guys are either fleeing back to Damascus where they think they're much safer. They go, well, shit, okay, we don't know where our supplies are coming from. If you're, let's say, based here, and you have all these reports on Telegram or wherever you are saying they're capturing roads all around you, you're going to go, well, shit, I don't know anything of what's going on. I'm just going to pull back to where I think it's safe, which is Damascus, regroup, and we'll strike back from there. But you do not want to be caught behind enemy lines. You want to make sure you have connected supply lines. At the same time, so many of your forces are either now pulling back to Damascus, effectively abandoning a lot of these towns, or simply fleeing to the coast, because again, they do not want to be the last ones out. So December 7th, the regime is pretty near collapse. HTS takes Homs, again, because most of the guys saw the pressure coming down upon them and just went, I'd rather be out of there, and start pulling out. Homs is taken, there is some fighting, but not nearly as bloody as people probably expected that battle to be. And at this point, Assad also hasn't made an address about this, which is quite worrying for a lot of people. So the press guys say that he's on the front lines or expecting troops. Others say he's already fled. There's all sorts around. But he, again, not making a statement is also puts big question marks in who's in command in Damascus. If you were, let's say, a big wartime leader, you'd probably want to be in the national broadcaster in a very notable location so people can't accuse you of having run. I think to Zelensky during the kind of very early days of the Ukraine invasion, where he stands there right in front of the radar and gives that speech, showing that you're willing to defend. The fact he's not doesn't really help the panic situation now setting in. Hezbollah also pulls the last of its forces back out of the country. They had very little garrison left in here, but they've pulled the last of their stuff back, which effectively means that Lebanon has abandoned them. And the opposition starts taking pretty key towns like Dara, and more commanders are fleeing. Other big one is we're starting to see real pushes toward Manbij. So now that the HTS is really moving south, the SNA guys are starting to push a lot of pressure on the last kind of big towns for the SDF on the West Bank of Euphrates River. And that's, again, we're starting to see more conflict and more focus on the SNA fighting these guys than we are on fighting Assad at this point. Because again, everyone knows that maybe wherever they sit in a day or two's time is probably where they're going to sit for a while. We also at this point, we also see Israel starting to bomb a lot of the border crossings into Lebanon, making it much more difficult for men to flee. They're also starting to carry out airstrikes into parts of Syria and make it even more difficult for the government to hold its positions. So again, panic. Now we're at that level. So we are arriving at the 8th. So I've divided the 8th into sort of 3 parts, but this is where effectively by this point on the 8th, so this is probably the morning of the 8th, the government ownership or government control has effectively ceased to exist in the center of the country. You can still comfortably say that the Assad is in control of the coast because that's where all the Russian supporters as well. But anyone who can get out is fleeing into Lebanon or fleeing out of the country in any way they can. And it's actually the southern guys who end up entering Damascus, even though there is an uprising of HTS aligned guys to the north, which again feels like every high school project I've ever had, where these guys do all the work, get all the way to Homs, and it's the random guy who stepped in at the last moment and takes all the credit. They come into Damascus and they find a pretty open door when they get there. Also, Israel now enters the country as well and starts establishing its buffer zone for its buffer zone. And Assad obviously flees to Russia. He will fly from here to Latakia, and from Latakia he'll fly off to Russia to spend the rest of his. Again, he was claiming that he was there to inspect that morning, but the fact he came with all his stuff and his wife, I don't know how many times I'd probably bring my wife for an inspection. It also says some of the key towns here on the west bank of the Euphrates actually flip and join HTS, which kind of starts to push the SDF back across points. Again, these are not well supplied, but I think the SDF guys here are probably just as badly supplied. SNA is also effectively taken the majority of Manbij and is now moving down here as well. So the SDF are under some pretty significant pressure at the moment, and are now having to decide whether they put their effort and resources into fighting for Manbij and fighting for here, or whether they try and hold good positions on this side of the river, or just try and pull back over the river where it's much easier to defend. Go B. Yeah. So Jelani in the afternoon will arrive in Damascus, and the southern guys will effectively pull out, but they still have assets in the city. But I think it's pretty well recognized that if they were to try and hold Damascus, it may break into fighting between them and the HTS, and HTS is better supplied and better trained. So Jelani ends up coming into the city in the afternoon. Again, there's almost no fighting down the road here as everyone's pulled back. You can just see morning to afternoon. I mean, that's a huge amount of territory gained, pretty much unopposed. Because again, everything's collapsed. This is pretty much all up for free for all now. But more clashes in Manbij. Manbij is about to fall as well. And here is where we get to actually the terrifying bit. Israel now sees its moment and decides that it will make sure that Syria is in a terrible position going to the new government, and will carry out a massive campaign of airstrikes right across the country. In fact, every one of these explosions is, an indicator for where a series of airstrikes are carried out. They will destroy ammo dumps, airports, headquarters, key bridges, infrastructure. They'll destroy the scientific research facility in Damascus, most of the intel and customs buildings. They will also hit most of the missile storage sites. The rumor is there's only one jet left in the Syrian Air Force after they've carried out the series of strikes. A lot of the crossing sites into Lebanon will be destroyed as well. They'll carry out they will roughly carry out about 680 airstrikes over the next 48 hours. It should give you an idea on how wild the Israelis went. Again, and this is alongside the roughly 75 strikes the US carried out over this period as well. They'll sink the majority of the Syrian Navy as well, particularly all the missile boats. Effectively, what is now being inherited by the HTS government is virtually no military capacity, which is going to make things really difficult for them going forward. And we'll talk about a bit that when we talk about winners and losers here. The only naval assets that survive are the ones that were kind of sitting in berths next to Russian ones, because I don't think the Israelis wanted to poke that hard. But when the Russians then moved things to different berths, so they were then pretty quickly sunk as well. So the 4th Division, so the one that run by his brother, is pretty much dissolved at this point, and we're starting to see, particularly by the Israeli 101st, start to occupy hills up here as well. We'll talk about that. So that brings us to the end. So that's effectively where the government collapses. And again, it feels like it was so sudden compared to the last couple of days. I mean, if you look at, let's go back here, December 8th, and then change it to, I don't know, let's go a week earlier, December 1st. It almost feels night and day. So again, I get why people feel like this is a 2-week collapse, but when we talked about it at the start, going, hey, look at these pillars start to really crumble. And here is where things lie today. You can see that effectively some of the major facilities have been occupied by HTS down here. The revolutionary guys are still holding their positions. I'm kind of just monitoring the roads, because those were really important roads for Iranian smugglers and whatnot coming through from Iran. The southern guys are still mostly in the Druze areas. Israel is now effectively overlooking some of the hills into Damascus. And lastly, but not least, you've still got Russia's positions here on the Mediterranean coast, them still technically occupying, although a lot of assets have been pulled out of Tartus and the airbase at Hamaim. Obviously, these may disappear as time goes on. It'll all depend on negotiations going forward between the Russians and the government. But at this point, everyone's still hedging bets, and I think the new government in Damascus is probably trying to make sure they either keep the Russians as a counterbalance to more Western forces or even the Turkish, who are starting to become more powerful in the region, or keep them there as what ammunition, weaponry, and so forth that they'll be using still will likely require Russian caliber weaponry or even Russian equipment. So I don't think anyone's in a particular hurry to kick out the Russians as things stand, but obviously that could change as things go on. They've done a bit better in some of the south here, but that's mostly just because the HTS guys haven't really consolidated their claims yet and are mostly focused on these more important crossings here in the southern. I'm sure that if real pressure starts to get applied, that there may be a pullback over to the other side of the river, but for now, do get to occupy this. You can also see that Manbij has been completely lost. So yeah, we are now seeing effectively a much stronger position for the SNA guys, probably a weaker position for the SDF guys, and Russia is now limited to this time. Israel's also gained more hold into the country. So this is not, a hard and fast rule. I'm just kind of putting a arbitrary numerical value to this. Let's say -5 is the worst position. You've absolutely suffered a catastrophic loss. +5 is the best gains you could possibly hope for. I'm just kind of trying to give an idea on where roughly how bad or how good the results of the conflict. Okay. So obviously the first player we're going to look at, Assad and the Syrian government, total loss, -5. Obviously their position is probably the worst out of everyone we're talking about here. They almost the entire government collapse, and Assad is now in Moscow. I had seen a rumor popping around the last couple of days that his wife has filed for divorce, saying that she doesn't like living in Moscow. I don't know how true that is. I think that would probably top off what is a pretty shitty year for Assad. But again, he has done some pretty awful things over the last few years. So yeah, absolute -5, worst possible loss out of everyone. HTS is the major winner here. They effectively are now seen as the power broker. They're the ones being approached by most of the power brokers outside. So Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Germany, all these kind of guys are starting to talk to HTS as the new government, or Jelani recognized being the kind of new de facto leader. They are going to have problems though. They've obviously now got military assets. Almost everything was destroyed by the Israelis. They've also got other factions in here, whether it be the SDF or the Southern guys, who are going to be other power balance problems they've got. And they've now got to govern a country that is poor, destroyed, and they're going to be seen as the harsh ruler in charge. And whether they need to try and assert their dominance over certain areas and use violence, that's going to get pushback. If they don't, that might encourage people to be more rebellious against them. So again, now they have the trouble and the difficulty of actually ruling it. So +4 rather than a 5. SDF, I think their position, that would be the yellow in our maps that we're using. Their position is worse, not by a huge amount. I mean, they've lost, obviously, Manbij. The SNA are a lot stronger than they went into this. And they were relying on effectively the Americans and the British to back them. And now the Americans and British can kind of more justifiably go deal with the HTS. Now that there's a new government, and that probably means that they're going to get less and less support going forward. And particularly as now the major power player here is Turkey. Turkey is pretty much the sworn enemy of the SDF. So you're now watching their sworn enemy become more powerful, their backers become less interested, and they've lost territory as well. So it's a loss, but they still hold a fairly decent position in the country. And the SEC, the light blue guys down in the south, they a major winner. Obviously, they are now seen as, I really, really hate this term, but like the opposition. They'd be the counterbalance to the HTS. And what you may see come over the next little while is this kind of southern-northern dynamic where you have northern guys aligned with the HTS and you have the southern guys aligned with the SOC. That is what particularly the Israelis are trying to sort of position at the moment, make sure they can get a powerful ally there and start to counterbalance. The Jordanians will probably help with that as well. Whether it pulls off, who knows? But they're in a much stronger position, where they are than what they were when they started. How much they'll be willing to be backed, or whether, let's say, if it does look like we end up in a North-South civil war, whether, outside players will be more interested in just saying, nope, no more. You have to everyone behave, let's be nice. It's still yet to be seen. Again, a lot of this is still really early and probably too early to tell. The RCA, so the Revolutionary Commando Army, they've gained some territory, but again, it's like desert roads connecting. And again, they held their position. That would be the really light blue stuff. So these guys, here, their position, was reliant on effectively being the US foothold in the region. If the US can deal with Jelani, then they probably become less important to the US. I'm sure the US will keep their facilities at Al-Tam. But yeah, I'd say overall, if they were hoping for money and backing, the US are probably going to be working much more closely with the HTS than they would with the RCA. So minor loss. The USA, minor gain. Having Assad out means they have much more freedom to deal with what they want. Obviously, this has hurt Russia's position as well, which is always nice. But now there's a question of what if Jelani is more religious than they require? And what if Turkey wants to be more influential in the region? Is Turkey going to be easy to deal with? Now, if, let's say, Jelani is successful in reuniting big parts of the country, what does a united Syria look like? Jelani, because he doesn't have this massive military to kind of hold things in check, or we thought hold things in check, will Jelani be able to actually hold off a nastier following civil war? Let's say if the Southern guys and the SDF and all these, and maybe even some of the other, like the SNA and whatnot, will they decide to go against the HTS? If he doesn't have this massive military, can he hold that? And do we end up in a nastier, even more fragmented civil war? So the USA has gained a slightly more easy to navigate position at the very moment we're talking and having this conversation. That could get worse. It's pretty early to tell. Turkey, major winner. Again, the two big power ascendancies here, apart from the Southern guys, but even then they have fairly good relations with the Southern guys, both Turkey back. Turkey's probably ended up the best position of everyone here, and Turkey will be the real power brokers in Syria for a while. So they're probably working away the winners here. Iraq, this is a major loss for Iraq. Not only is Jelani being Sunni, you're watching a bunch of the Shia guys having fled into Iraq. A lot of the military officers, a lot of your fighters have now fled into Iraq, almost the exact same way that happened after the collapse of the 2003 government or Saddam Hussein's government. You're watching instability right there on the border. This may encourage one of these regional groups who was so easily able to overthrow the government, may encourage more regionalism in Iraq as well. If the SDF, let's say, start to really fall apart, or that movement increasingly becomes more Arab driven, you might watch more of the Kurds within that group start to move into Kurdish Iraq. There are a whole bunch of flow-on effects from this that make it much more difficult for Baghdad to operate. So this is a pretty major loss for the Iraqis. Israel, it's partial gain. They've obviously got more territory. They've got out, they've destroyed almost all of the air assets, particularly things like the S-115s. They don't have Russia, has not nearly the position right across the country that cause problems. But they've also got a much more fundamentalist government, possibly. Again, it's really too early to tell, but they have a lot more religiously driven government sitting on the border now. There was very little chance that someone like Assad would, the argument, go in and try and conquer Israel. But now you might have, let's say, if there's a very religiously driven government sitting in Syria, they might try and encourage religious groups inside Israel or inside Gaza or Palestine or Golan Heights to rebel against the government in Israel. So it could be good, it could be bad. I think as things stand today, probably better than not, but it's really too early to tell for Israel. Lebanon, major loss. Again, you've now effectively, particularly Hezbollah was really reliant on Syria as this kind of geographic choke point to be able to sort of sell Captagon into the rest of the Middle East. It was also its connecting point to the Shia territories in Iraq and Iran. It was also a good training ground. It was a fairly ungoverned space they could operate in with some of their militias. A lot of assets could be moved in and out. This was a big problem for Hezbollah now. So they're effectively isolated and have very little way of getting to their main benefactors in Iraq and Iran. So particularly Hezbollah, this is problematic. For Lebanon, obviously having this much infrastructure, refugees, a new government, all now appearing in Syria as well, that is going to put more pressure on an already situation in Lebanon. Russia, major loss. Actually, I probably would now, I'm thinking about it again, I've -2. Syria is a major loss of prestige. Was one of the better positions for them, but it was a very expensive thing for the Russians to hold on to. Obviously, it does really help them. Right now, effectively, Russia will use Syria as a stopover point for any operations in Africa. Russia can kind of get away with this at the moment by using Libya. And we have seen talks over the last couple of days where they are starting to talk about either possibly establishing a naval base in Tobruk, which is in the sort of the Russian-aligned eastern government of Libya, or Russia starts to build up their bases in the country. So Russia, this could be, it's a loss of liability. It's a loss of bases. They've had to go to get all this stuff out there. But Tartus has not been a particularly economically great area for a while. It doesn't have the heavy repair facilities. So anything that needed to be repaired in Tartus, rather than, let's say it was in the Black Sea, it could be pulled back to Tartus. Now it has to go all the way back to St. Petersburg anyway, or Kronstadt. If you're looking at where they operate more these days, Russia is far busier in Africa than it is in the Middle East these days. So having something in Libya is justifiably better. On top of that, they do still technically have the 102nd base out in Armenia, but it will now force them to either lean on the Armenians to get even more support out of them, which again is a big question mark, as we just went through with a recent episode, or they're going to have to start building up facilities in Libya pretty quick. Now, we have seen them renovate some of the airstrips and air bases out in northern Libya, and that's only happened in the last recent months, which kind of also a bit of an indication that maybe Russia saw this coming. But yes, major loss of prestige, makes it more difficult for them. Is it a loss, a collapse of the Russian doctrine or Russian position? Probably not. Not great, though. It's also going to now effectively make sure they have to be much nicer to the Turkish. Because, again, if Syria falls into a whole bunch of problems going forward, that could be problematic for the Caucasus. And now Turkey's the big power broker. So again, not only have you lost any heavy equipment, you've had to abandon any of the oil deals and any of the oil fields that they'd been investing in are probably gone. They might still hold on to the positions at Khmeim. Really, it's too early to tell. Depends how comfortable HTS feels. If they feel they can get all the backing they need from the West or Turkey, maybe they kick the Russians out and let the people have a bit of a sweep out. If they feel that it might be better to balance everyone off each other, considering there is already US bases in the country, maybe they feel that that's probably a good place to keep them there for that. Russia's also now seeing this will weaken Iran as well, which again, if it's hoping to have a stronger ally in the Middle East, a weak Iran is not friendly. What this can do, though, without having to garrison and support those forces in Syria, means they can probably divert some of those back to Ukraine. We have seen some of the S-400s already go to Libya, but I'm sure there'll be more missile batteries heading to Ukraine, where they're probably much more needed than they were in Syria. And the last one is the EU. It's probably still too early to tell. I know I've seen a lot of talk of people saying, look, now the war's over, Syrians who got led into the EU on refugee status now need to be back. That'll be a far-right talking point for a long time. We're probably going to see Turkey become much more powerful and a much more powerful power broker in the Middle East. And that's, the EU never feels more comfortable with that. We don't know if there's another civil war that breaks out of this, and that's obviously going to be worrying a lot of EU policymakers. I think they'd like to see the HTS take a much stronger position, and if they can hold that, then effectively maybe the situation calms down enough that they can feel comfortable. And they're also going to have a problem that this new dynamic between the southern clans, which are more aligned with Israel, and the northern clans, which are more aligned with Turkey. Those are two sides that a lot of EU nations will not feel comfortable trying to pick between in that political strife down the road. But it's still way too early to tell. This is, we're talking lots of hypotheticals here. Generally, though, here's a very, very, very rough look at this. Iraq, bad. Iran. Armenia might have Russia coming hand in hand, but very little gain. Turkey, big gain. Qatar has got a better position. They've been backers of the HTS. UAE is probably not as happy about it. They probably would prefer to have had Assad in. They were starting to warm relations a bit. Israel's in a slightly better position. Lebanon in a rough position. We also had, Cyprus, who was hoping effectively to do a lot of gas work here, was in a position where it could almost guarantee that no one was going to buy the gas out of Syria or support that. If, let's say, we do have a government that can legitimately form and we'll start to look at gas exploration right here, that will probably start to impinge on what they thought might be free hands in here. So it's not great. It's not the worst. Yeah, fairly neutral positions for most of these guys. Iraq, Iran, Russia hopefully have done without this headache for this week. How much of a loss for Iran is it? It's pretty big. Again, Iran at the moment, it uses this kind of path here, what it calls the Shia Crescent, for lack of a better word. And again, I'm going to have Syria analysts pulling their hair out because they hate that term. But it was a better way of supplying and connecting itself with Hezbollah and effectively making sure that a strong Lebanon keeps Israel busy here. But now if Lebanon's fallen apart, Syria's not a problem. Now Israel will effectively be focused on Iraq or even into Iran. And that's not where Iran wants to be. So it's a pretty bad situation for the Iranians. They're probably in the biggest losers out of this whole thing. Iraq, though, now it'll be interesting to see whether the Western nations start to sort of pump more money and pump more effort into Iraq to make sure that it does maintain stability, or start to see some of these Shia groups or smaller factions in here get more emboldened by what's happening in Syria and try and make a push for it, because the Iraqi government is not holding particularly well at the moment for a whole myriad of reasons. Azerbaijan, they have been backers of the SNA and the HDS very mildly. It's more just, hey, when Turkey does stuff, Azerbaijan tends to follow as well. So I think that is it. There's 2 hours of rambling about Syria. It's been an absolute pleasure. I look forward to chatting with you all soon. And I'm going to go to bed now because it's 5:30 in the morning.